right, well, do you want to get into it?
Yeah, let's go ahead.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG podcast. I am Clayton.
Now I'm Eliot.
Before we get started, you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. And if you would like to help us out with supporting the show, you can do so at patreon.com/alienfamiliarmedia. So if you enjoy our content and would like to help us out with hosting costs, any help you would be able to give us would be greatly appreciated. Thank you for joining us today. Today, our topic, we are going to be talking about why exactly we play video games. Why we play tabletop role-playing games, and we'll be expanding that, not just our personal experience and our personal motivations, but we'll also kind of be delving into more existentially why tabletop role-playing games are a good medium for people to spend their free time. So, Eliot, this is your topic. You were the one who came up with this idea. Why is it that you play role-playing games?
I think hopefully as this conversation goes on, we're gonna, it's gonna peel away like an onion. I think there's many layers, but I think the most obvious and good place to start the conversation is the clear escapist nature of it. Your slip in video games, I think, also has a vein of that as well, but I think there are a lot of different reasons why people tabletop RPG versus play a video game. But the first most obvious thing for me is, you get the opportunity to live out and to almost mentally slip into the skin of a character that I would imagine, at least for me, that I know that I don't have any opportunity to be like in real life. So the ability to put on a heroic garb and wield some sort of weapon. I'm going to say sword, but role-playing games are various. Some are gunslinging games, some are laser shooting, sci-fi games. But inevitably, I think it's a way for me to jump into the role of an adventuring hero and go save the day, which in our current world and probably not in too many other past versions of the world even do many people get the opportunity to actually experience that. So it's that's to me is the most obvious reason. What about you?
Well, before we get into mine, I just want to say that I knew we were going to be talking about escapism, and escapism is a huge pet peeve of mine for a quote reason why we game. Because at least whenever I was learning how to play role-playing games and in my early 20s, escapism was a bad word. It was a demeaning word. It was, it's just escapism.
It's very beta male, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's not escapism. It's a form of maintaining mental health. I want to make very clear that I view this distinction as it's not just escapism. It's not just getting out of whatever situation I'm in order to live some fantasy. This is something that I do to help maintain my mental health. This is something I do to help maintain a sense of control in my life. Because especially whenever you're in your teens and 20s and even into your 30s, there's not a whole lot of real control that you feel like you have in your life. And being able to play this game and have this sense of control in the bounds of the game, either not just the character, but also the fact that I can have the control of setting aside a certain amount of time during the week or during the month or whenever to play. This is something that I can consistently get into and participate in and practice my mental health in de-stressing from the world around me. That's one of the main reasons why I currently play the game, is for the mental health aspect that that it brings me. I have shared with my face-to-face groups a number of times over the years. I've had to deal with some really heavy shit in my life. Everybody does. Everybody deals with heavy shit. That's just part of life. But being able to separate from the things that are just pressing down on you and making your life miserable, being able to get with a group of friends, being able to get together and laugh and have a good time, to stretch or to flex creative muscles that you probably don't have a way of exercising in other ways. Just being able to get around a group of people and just shoot the shit, have fun for 4 hours at a time. Mental health is the reason why I continue to play the game. That's the number one reason why I continue to play role-playing games.
Whew. I love it. I loved every second of that. That's great. And I was worried going into the topic we would have a difficult time like keeping the steam up for this, but I'm looking forward to this. I completely agree with you. I love that you said that, because maybe escapism, I think, is an aspect of it, I guess, but I maybe framing it differently as an outlet. I think that's kind of, you correctly guided it in that kind of an idea, and I completely agree, because when I think of escapism too, and other ways that I've noticed my peers escape, I would consider television, an escape that a lot of people, everybody gets around the water cooler at the workplace, and one of the things that anymore is a very common thing that people talk about is like, what are you binging? What's your binge show? And I certainly do plenty of just, zombieing out on social media, say, or zombieing out watching 6 or 7 episodes of TV or something like that. But one thing I do think that I don't do it to the extent I get the impression a lot of my peers do, because what I love about role-playing games, which has guided me even into other sort of outlets, is that as a very young age, it's creative, it's active. To me, almost like when we say escapism, to me that almost implies a bit of like turning it off, turning your brain off, being able to go into kind of like an idle mode, and becoming a consumer of someone else's creative output, so that you can kind of turn yourself off. But role-playing games as an outlet is completely different than that. It's be it on either side of the table, the DM or the player, it is a creative act. It can at times be exhausting, as a project. But that's what's great about it, is if I feel like I'm getting that escape from the stresses and whatever vicissitudes of life, but I'm doing it in a way that's constructive, that's creative, that I know I go back and rewatch, say, The Office from time to time, but there's a difference when I go through my old role-playing books and I see old character sheets and things like, at the end of the day, I created something with my outlet, and I feel like it's such a constructive way to spend your free time, and it's very therapeutic. Absolutely. I had another thought about it. Let's talk about the community of it. That's another aspect to it that makes it different than other ways that I've noticed other people escape. Another way that it's different from your typical escapism and more of an outlet is that it draws you around a table, even if it's a virtual table. It's collaborative. It's a way of having social relations. I talked to Jordan, even though he wasn't able to participate in this podcast. I gave him a call and we talked about this topic as a way for me to kind of get in the headspace for it. And when we were talking about it, he mentioned that something that's true for me, I'm sure you too, is that it's, role-playing games are the origin story for pretty much all of my lifelong friendships. I'm having a hard time. I can really only think of 1 or 2 people that I would say that I'm close with as friends, that friendship didn't start around a role-playing game. And it's if for no other reason, that's why it's one of the greatest things that got kind of came to my life, was because you can really, I found that it's very conducive to not just making friends, but making really strong friendships that last the ages. You know what I mean?
Yeah, like I have not made any new friends after high school and college. I have not made any new friends who I didn't make explicitly because I started gaming with them. Even high school and college, those friends who I was closest to, we got into the hobby. We got into the hobby together, or I casually knew them and invited them to the game, and we became good friends that way. But after college, my way of meeting new people was limited to work and role playing games. And work isn't a great way of meeting people who share lifelong interests.
Oh man, that's a separate podcast and a separate diatribe I can totally go on. I've met people who have made good friendships in the workplace, but maybe it's just my personality, or just in my experience, those friendships typically end when those work relationships end. But I definitely feel like the average person, as an adult anyway, really relies on work as a weird pale version of friendship, but it certainly isn't where I find it. Golly, as far as, so why do you think that is? Why do you think, what's your opinion on why sitting around a role playing table? Is it just because it usually is an adolescent thing? Do you think it's because I know I started playing when I was a kid. You started playing when you were a kid. I don't know too many people who started playing in adulthood. And, just when you're young, I think you're prone to making those bonds. Do you think that's where that starts, is just when you're a kid, you make your lifelong friends, and whatever, be it football or any other activity, that's just how it happens? Or do you think there's something unique about role-playing games that lend to making like lasting bonds with other people?
Well, through my personal experience, like high school, like before high school, I met some friends, and like you do whenever you're a kid, you meet them because you share a class with them. I lived in a pretty rural area, so my only source of socialization was through class, was through school. I lived the closest person within 2 years of my age, besides my family, lived 2 miles away. That guy was a year older than me, and to be perfectly honest, that guy was an asshole. He was a bully, so I hated spending time with him. But I met people through school. That was my sole way of meeting people who were my peers. When I got into high school and I got old enough to share interests like video games and comic books and things like that, I met some people and hung out with them. But I watched a lot of movies with certain friends, but it was really role-playing games that got me to sit around with them and basically explore who I was, taking on the different roles of different characters and experimenting with ideologies, with, like, whenever you're a teenager and also early 20s, you really are experimenting with finding out who you are, what your voice is, what your outlook on life is. And role-playing games give you that opportunity to try those out in a pretty much consequence-free, I mean in the real world, not having a real world consequence of like going out and doing things. And I shared those experiences with other people, and that is what caused those friendships to get stronger, is because we were discovering who we were together. And after college, when I when role-playing games became my only way of meeting new people. Like literally everybody on this who has been on this podcast since the beginning of the podcast are friends that I either met the first time I met them was because I had met them at a game shop to play a role-playing game with them, or in your instance, Eliot, I met you because of a friend I met through Jordan. I met you at one of Jordan's parties, and you are a role player too.
Yeah, we're a tribe. I think I don't know if it's just that maybe role playing games, like anything other interests, attract personality types. Or I say that and immediately like my mind rebels against that. I think there's something transformative about coming to the table. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, so I really don't have any way of saying that, but for sure. But I have met a very diverse group of people around the role playing table. At least with my personal journey, role playing games was something that was born out of a community that already existed. You know, I had a game shop that I just was lucky enough that I didn't live in a particularly urban area, but I lived in kind of a suburbia at when I was in my, teenage adolescent years, and there happened to be a pretty close gaming shop that had, and it wasn't at the time, it was mainly about Magic the Gathering and card games, which I feel attract a wide, surprisingly enough, a pretty wide net of people play that. And card games in general. There were people who were very popular in their school lives that didn't go to my school. There were people who, when they left the game shop, they might go to the football field and, walk in those circles. And then you'd have people who were just your goth kind of social outcast people. And so, I mean, I played around very diverse groups of individuals when we played role-playing games. But the fact that the books were there were people playing, you just eventually get interested. And so, but once you sit down and you play it, and if it catches you, I mean, there are plenty of people I know who maybe I played with them a couple times, it wasn't their cup of tea, and they walked off. But once it sinks its teeth into you, like you said, and sometimes it's overt and talked about, and sometimes it's always kind of like, subconscious maybe, or never spoken. But you learn a lot about a person whenever they create a character from scratch and then try to inhabit that fictional character and give it life. And whenever it's kind of vulnerable, right? I mean, maybe that's the word that's popping into my mind, is that, for instance, a black and white example, I knew a guy, he was older than us. There was a lot of adults and a lot of adolescents that mingled in this game shop, but a common player that I haven't seen in years, but if I saw him on the street tomorrow, we would immediately be chatty and hanging out. And he was just your mild-mannered, super nice guy. He was very religious, and he very mild-mannered, extremely polite, not a violent guy whatsoever. When you put him at the role-playing table, though, you always knew he was going to bring the biggest sword, he was going to wear the biggest armor, he was going to be a devout paladin of some god, and he was going to go killing for his beliefs. You know what I mean? He played it every time. He found a way to make that character in any game, any setting, and that's just what brought him to the table. And, that very inward, polite human in reality, definitely he got something out of letting a very righteous, unforgiving, inflexible, part of his personality have a voice, and he did it through role-playing games. And, at the time it was kind of a joke, we always know what he was going to play, but, I mean, looking back on it now, I gotta, everybody at the table had a very clear glimpse into his soul. And in a way that just your average friendships, your other communities, other kinship groups don't really, I think, give you that same window, or it's really difficult to find that window into somebody's personality. And that, whereas role-playing games just immediately just open the door to anybody who's at the table. And you leave that table, having kind of shared something with another person in a way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you really learn how people think whenever you're playing role-playing games. Like me myself, I have developed my way of thinking, like problem solving. Like I have developed those through role-playing games, and having watched so many other people role play, sometimes multiple like sometimes dozens of different characters, you start to see through lines for those characters, and you start to see, like you said, you do see a little bit into the person's soul. You see core pieces of their character that is the same no matter what persona they're putting on. There are certain parts of that person that always shine through, and you can learn really who you can depend on if things got bad, who you could depend on. And without like a role-playing game, it's kind of hit or miss. You kind of got to get into a bad situation before you really find out who your friends are. But through role-playing games, you have that excuse of having been through, quote, bad situations in character to learn those things about other people before the shit hits the fan.
Here's something I have jotted down that I wanted to touch on. We talked a little bit off pod about the satanic panic, and I don't want to get into that specifically, but I think that you and I both touched on the fact that when we got into tabletop role-playing games and gaming in general, but especially, I mean, if my parents didn't understand Magic the Gathering when I got into it, they had absolutely no clue. I think they kind of gave up on really understanding where my mental was as a young boy when I started asking for role-playing games. And they started watching me, create these little characters on paper and, carry, it's funny, I was the guy in high school that, prided himself on his C average. But that was in part because, if you looked at me as a student, it looked like I was the best student in the room because I had a binder. It was color coded. It was, every page was covered in plastic sheets. I would take notes and then go home and top those notes up. And it had nothing to do with my class because it was always my role-playing game. And, it would look like I would be doing great work, except until my teacher looked over my shoulder and realized I was doing absolutely nothing related to their class whatsoever. But so that being said, the point I was trying to make was rebellion. I feel like there is a bit of the culture, at least maybe because it's becoming more mainstream and nerd culture is so accepted in this generation. But in the 90s, when I started role playing, it definitely was, there was a bit of like, what's the word? It was almost risque. It was almost like, I'm not sure you should be doing that. It was very like attractive in that way because I felt like I was doing something that was subculture. It was my own kind of almost way to rebel against my middle class, working class, sports oriented church, facing, family life. And whenever I took an interest in role-playing games especially, that to me was so far away from my family's kind of experience. I've noticed they didn't stop me, but they certainly didn't, feel like it was a worthy pursuit. And I can't even count on my fingers how many conversations I had with my folks who they would have serious sit downs with me about why am I doing this and why am I spending all my time at that game shop and why do I keep getting C's, and all these things, and really kind of low key being concerned about me. Not really, but to me that just drove me there more and made me love it even more because it was something that was just mine. And I had my own tribe that they didn't understand. And when I remember walking into that game shop on game day, it was like I was playing in the Super Bowl. I would be so hyped because I felt like 90% of my life I was, living in the world that I was kind of out of step with. And then when I walked into that game shop, I was home. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it was a subculture that you were a part of, and that's what I mean, especially whenever you're a teenager, that's what you want and need, because like you teenagers by definition feel apart from the world around them, and to have something that you can go to and to be a part of. You said you were using the word tribe. I wholeheartedly agree with that, but you realize that you're not alone. You're a part of something bigger. You're a part of a community, and you go there and you share interests with other people, and there are like nowadays with the proliferation of like conventions and things like that, there are so many opportunities now to go and see that you are a part of a much larger group. And like social media the same way. You can join like groups on Facebook or like Reddit pages or Reddit subs and things like that to be a part of a larger community that, like, where we live in rural areas, grew up in rural areas, you don't have that opportunity to have people around you that have the same interests as you, and being a part of something, having all those other people who are into the same things is such a big part of feeling welcome, part of feeling like you have a place where you belong.
Oh man, I remember. I remember we would travel to Origins in the '90s in Columbus, and it was the premier gaming con at that time in the Midwest. Before Gen Con moved to, I believe, Indianapolis, it kind of stole a bit of its thunder. But when we were going to Origins, it was like Mecca. Like it was religious. The feeling that you would get, it's like that same feeling of here I am, I'm at home, walking into my game shop with 10 or 20 people, multiplied by 40,000 or however many people would be at Origins. Everybody there for that same. It just the tribe got so big when it was just very exciting. I remember it being a big part of my childhood. This. Something else I have bulleted down that I think this is a great segue into is just, I mean, we've talked a lot about just the kinship community aspects. There's a lot of pro-social aspects to role-playing in general, role-playing games. Are there any specific details or any particular skills that you think that role-playing games give you access to that maybe you can get in other ways in life, but just are particularly good at giving players an access to?
Yeah, I would say cooperation and teamwork. Not just in the game. I mean, like setting a schedule for we are going to meet up at this time, at this place, and we are going to be doing things together. We are going to be getting together, and we are going to be problem solving. We're going to be tackling issues and working together to come to solutions. I really wish I could put role-playing games on my resume and point those out. I've been very tempted, like, to put on my resume that I am a GM and point out, hey, for 20 years now, I have been able to basically herd cats and get people to come together regularly to meet and problem solve.
I have a lot of thoughts on this particular point, and I would never have mentioned that one in particular. That is such an understated aspect to role-playing games, because, I mean, the least responsible people are adolescent males, I think, especially middle-class adolescent males. And yeah, I mean, I remember, setting those schedules, man, and it was a big deal. I mean, if you wanted to be a part of the community, I mean, it's your brother's birthday, it's your mom's birthday, it's, there's a school dance on game night. No, I got to be at the shop at 5:00. Let's hurry this up. You know what I mean? I'd be on the phone, if my mom and dad would be like, oh, we got this or that going on today, we can't take you, we're not driving you there. I mean, I was on the phone networking, getting my butt to the shop because I knew that, if I didn't show up at the table, there's only so many times you can do that and continue to get that seat guaranteed, right? I mean, that's a I mean, I was never when I could drive, I was never on time to school. There was no other part of my life that I made the effort to get to, but as an adult, that's just a skill set that I feel like has been helpful to me. Um, Seems so silly, but like just, getting to work on time, um, living up to your professional commitments and doing the work and being prepared, DMing especially, but even playing, teach those, they kind of embed those skills in you, or else you're not going to be able to be a part of the hobby for sure. Another pro-social aspect I think is understated that I want to get your thoughts on this, but I've got some professional examples as well, is just empathy. I think that by putting on another person's persona, even if you make them up, you have to think about things in a very meta way that I can't think of too many other common activities really force you to do that. You have to think about this character because, your character shouldn't just be you, right? That's a part of it. It's just not a carbon copy of yourself with a sword. You have to really think like, oh shoot, I've got a really low charisma for this character. How is that going to interact? How is that going to come out? How am I going to play that? The whole point of role-playing games, in my opinion, if you're doing it right, is that you're trying to imagine yourself in another person's perspective and another person's way of being. And you do that over and over and over again over the course of years. I have found in my own life that I just feel like empathy is my superpower. I feel like my ability to see where other people are coming from is just this secret little skill that I have that when I function in my professional and personal life is not as common as I just took for granted when I was younger, and it's been a real help to me. What do you think?
So I agree. Empathy is definitely something that you really do pick up for all the reasons that you said. And I have been in games as a player and DM where another player has been trying out some things in their life that they were not comfortable with expressing to the greater world. Specifically, I have been in games where people have tried out different orientations, like sexual orientations, or trying out whether or not they actually are a non-binary person. And for that person, it's a great outlet for expression, for finding out if that is who you are. But also, as somebody who is there at the table playing off of that, you are learning how your treatment of a person like that, how that can impact them, how you can be a force of good or a force of evil in their life. And that is something that I have seen, and I am grateful to role-playing games for having put me in that situation in a much in a situation that doesn't have the pressure of real life, and being able to try out what is the best way of interacting in that situation. What is the more empathetic way of supporting somebody as they are doing this? Or if I'm a shitty person toward them, how does that actually make them feel?
Yeah, golly, this is a walk down memory lane, but the pro-social aspects, I think, like you're touching on, in my experience, was both on and off the table because we're in the same generation. We're about the same age. I started role-playing in a community of fellow misfits, 14, 15 years old. And, to younger folks who are blessed to live in not a perfectly permitting and open world, but a much more accepting world to just non-traditional, like the LGBTQ community, even women, in general. I can't express how difficult it was even in the 90s for people like that, and there was definitely multiple people at our table over the years, and continue to be, who they definitely have the license to let that part of their personality to be open, and have people who off the table who I mean, just in particular, I don't want to go in, nobody that's ever been on the podcast or anything like that, but there were people, I knew an adult who was married and had seemed to have a good relationship, but he was definitely a part of that community, and he had a hard time. He walking, talking, looking like a normal dude. He didn't, and not to say that gay people or whatever, can't just look like an average person. The stereotypes aren't always true, but definitely was a reserve. He had that part of his personality held in the back of his pocket, and when he would come to the table, he had the cover and the permission, I guess maybe we'd call it a safe space today, to let that side of him come out. And I think that played a big part of his mental health at that time. I know just from personally knowing him off the table, he stepped away from gaming as far as I know, and his life, that person's mental didn't, he had some tough times, once he kind of separated from our group and maybe stopped the gaming and stuff like that. I feel like it was very helpful to him, and I think the troubles that he went through after the fact shows how helpful it was whenever that was no longer a part of his life. I wanted to touch on this is a weird segue, but education and kids, because growing up as a role play gamer, I was kind of surprised when I'm a school teacher, and I work with kiddos who have disabilities, right? And a lot of them are emotional disabilities. And one of the things that come up most often when, tasked with teaching pro-social behaviors is not role-playing games, but those do exist now, and they are kind of an area that some people in education are actually dabbling in, making educational role-playing games to use with kids to help develop things like social skills, turn taking, and being polite and things like that. But just the concept of role-playing as a way to educate children in social and even in historical contexts, putting people in a different time and place. Role-playing is a word. It's a thing that comes up that's often suggested to work in some role-playing activities where kids can take on different personalities. I felt like I got the benefits of that just around the role-playing table, but what we're talking about, I think, is echoed in my professional life too. There's something to it that is definitely educational and pro-social, right?
Yeah, I mean, you could say that role-playing games are just an extension of a kid playing pretend with rules around it and a structure around it to allow a person to continue to like learn how to socially interact, learn how to communicate. I've heard stories of like people with high functioning autism and using role-playing games to kind of experiment around and learn how to interact with people in a variety of situations. Because one of the things with autism is there's a lot of people with autism have trouble understanding just social interaction, and a role-playing game gives them multiple opportunities to try out and find what works, because a lot of people with autism, they form basically conversational rules or interaction rules to help guide them through interactions with other people because it's not something that comes naturally to them. And so role-playing games give them that opportunity to be put into more situations and develop more rules for them to help guide themselves through interaction with other people.
Wow. So much to say for sure. Yeah, in my professional life, autistic kiddos are definitely the ones that you hear in the literature that comes role playing is definitely something aimed at that population. But in my own personal life, I don't care to share that my son is high functioning autistic. He was diagnosed with autism at 4 years old, and that is 100% been true in my personal experience. And it's not so much an overt thing. I mean, he's not a pencil and paper gamer yet, but just I think my background in role playing games and all the skills we've been talking about, in my interactions with him, it's constantly something that we're doing is I'm urging him, I'm helping him, because he'll open up to me and talk about things where he just doesn't understand why people act the way they do. He doesn't relate to them because social deficits and being able to relate to other people, not in a negative connotation whatsoever, but the only word that comes up in my mind is like narcissism. It's very difficult for him, at least, to put himself in some, think about the other person in the room, and to, and that comes out in conversation, constantly monologuing about personal interests. And it's been a big help to have those experiences in my past, that I find that when we get into these situations where I'm trying to help push him in that direction to be more self-aware of the people around him, I'm constantly relying on the lessons I learned on role-playing games and how I frame my conversations with him. So, I mean, that's both true in my personal and professional life.
Yeah, and other skills that, particularly whenever you're a teenager, that you are like, teenager is the time when the parts of the brain are developing for things like critical thinking, deep problem solving, more advanced socialization, communication, personal expression. These are all things that role-playing games, that are a part of role-playing games at the core of what you are doing whenever you're getting around the table and playing. And for teenagers, that's why this game seems to resonate so well for people in their teens and early 20s, is because that is literally the time of their lives when these parts of the brain are developing and coming online. And these games give them an opportunity to use these abilities, like these literal abilities that they are just now gaining.
Oh man, this is segueing perfectly into the last thing I have bulleted, and trigger warnings, I guess. I don't think there's anything controversial about some of these things I'm about to say, but it's definitely something from my own personal perspective I want to give some time to, because I've thought about it a lot as a what it was that appealed to me. And I in my day-to-day life, everybody's day-to-day, we are a community. Everybody more than ever works. Most people in these days in the information economy, I guess they'd call it, collaboration and cooperation is super important. But on the other side of that, when I was a kid, before role-playing games, when I was young, I was raised in a rural area, and then we moved into the suburbs when I was about 10. And when I was little, I would watch movies on TV, and constantly rotating was a lot of the monomyths that in the 80s and before always revolved around some young, usually white dude who faced a challenge and through personal ability and exceptionalism was able to go out and conquer, usually with a sword, but sometimes with a laser sword, but always go out and defeat some great evil. And I know that, whenever I've noticed in my experience, this is why I wish that I knew, or we had more access to a lot of female gamers, because I've played with a lot of female gamers, and I would love that perspective. But for me personally, I always find myself, I feel like subconsciously, if not overtly, a lot of my role playing games give permission for a more just unapologetic, what I would call masculinity, to come out in me, in my play and in my characters. And by that I mean I'm a people person. I'm very cooperative. I'm good in those settings. But things that are not good in those settings are like being brash, being assertive, being violent if the situation calls for it. Not to be a peacemaker, but to be confrontational. And that's what a hero often does. They have to go out and they have to confront, and oftentimes they use violence to accomplish those aims. And I can't help but notice that in role-playing games, at least, that just seems to be a seed that it kind of grew out of. That's very much what it's geared to give access to, and encourages you, at least the original books especially. And do you feel the same way? And do you think that role-playing games in general are trying to be less focused on that aspect of it to give it more wide appeal? Or do you think am I completely off base, or is there something to it?
So, anecdotally, I can say that every feminine person who I have introduced to role-playing games, either their first character or their second character is that aggressive, brash, wanting to do violence to other people type of character. This is my personal experience, having taught role-playing games to a few women over the years. And it's not just this masculine thing. It is this primal drive that I see in people, that they want to have this outlet for an aggression. And I feel like, particularly for, like, in our culture, women are raised to not be aggressive, not be loud, not be all of these things that we attribute to masculine. Giving them the opportunity to do this in a role-playing game, they take it and they fucking run with it.
Yeah, the word itself is maybe the most, what's the word? The most, maybe bias is the one that's coming to my mind, but using the word masculine definitely does exactly what you're saying. It cuts off. It implies that there's no appeal to those things that I attribute to masculinity for females, and that's just clearly not true in all my experiences as well with female players. Is that I think all of us have in us a desire to be aggressive and to be self-righteous and self-confident in a way that the world, especially these days, is very discouraging of, or it doesn't necessarily prioritize that as a way to get success for average people. But and I could see why those ladies who pursue gaming and make it a big part of their life, that I know, that's been true as well in my experience. It's kind of, maybe it's misogynistic to even bracket all those things I mentioned as masculine in general. That's just maybe a part of the human condition that both male and female don't have as many outlets for, and that's why role-playing games appeal to them. Good point.
Yeah, aggression is not a masculine or feminine quality. It is a primal part of being a living being. It's part of fight or flight. And fight isn't something that a lot of people have experience with or have opportunities to engage in their day-to-day lives. And just having a role-playing game give somebody the opportunity to do it in a place where it is not only a potential positive, but it is actively encouraged to be that way. I feel like that's another great thing about role-playing games.
It's so therapeutic, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Clayton, we've hit all my bullet points. Do you have anything highlighted or underscored we haven't touched on?
I have one last thing I'm going to say, and then we'll go on to geek things as my last point of great things about role-playing games is that particularly whenever you're playing a tabletop role-playing game and you're doing it in person, the benefit is that it gets your face out of a fucking screen.
So true.
All right, let's go on to geek
Can I touch
things.
on one last thing? I'll make it super brief. I'm not good at that, but I will.
Sure, go right ahead.
This is a rant against current education. By God, it teaches you how to add. You had mentioned it off camera or off screen or whatever, and I bulleted it and I didn't talk about it. Is that, I am amazed at how my basic addition and subtraction is superior to everyone. I'm not a math-minded person, mind you. Did not do well in algebra, did not do well in geometry. The higher levels of math just weren't my thing. But when it just comes to basic addition and subtraction, I can do it faster, more accurately. It's called automaticity. It's something that is not necessarily prioritized in current education with mathematics, but it's key. And man, I'm amazed at how many adults just cannot add single and two-digit numbers. That's all I'm going to say. And D&D has definitely made me a whiz at basic addition subtraction.
Here, here. Do you want to start with geek things?
Yeah, sure. I have a weird one, as usual, but we just passed 9/11. Not going to dwell on that specifically, but a couple of months ago, maybe a month ago, I read an article in The Atlantic by a lady named Jennifer Senior, and the title of her article is "Grief and Conspiracy 20 Years After 9/11." And I don't know what attracted me to it because we just now had the anniversary, but I read it and it's popped up in my social media feed a lot, people going back to it. And if you have a moment, or especially if you're someone who wasn't born in that time and you really want to feel the impact and the severity of that day, she knew someone who was in the tragic, who passed away in that tragic event. And what she did was that she revisited that person's family members and spent some time with them to just understand what their life has been like the last 20 years and how the absence of that child and brother and husband has had the impact it's had on all the people involved. And it really does a great job of reminding people of how intimately tragic and how the loss of a single individual, whether it be in a tragedy or in any loss, is life-changing for them. It ripples throughout communities, the effects that even the loss of one person before their time can have. And you get to know this family. It's a great piece. Go read it. It's awesome. It's not a geek thing. It's a human thing, but it was the most interesting, thoughtful thing I've encountered recently. And so that's my geek thing.
Well, my geek thing, although this has existed for a while, I just learned about it a couple of weeks ago, but there is a website called GeoGuessr, and what this site does is it's a game, and you can play the game once per day for free. You can pay more to play it more often, but basically what it does is it uses Google Maps, and it plops you down along a road that the Google vehicle has taken pictures of somewhere. Well, there's several different modes, but the mode I play is it drops you somewhere in the world, and just by using you can move along the road, like follow the path of the Google vehicle to go along the road and see what all you can see around you, and try to pick up clues, and you make a guess where in the world you are, and you get scored based on how close to the real world location you are at the end of the rounds. I get a big kick out of it. I've only played it on the world mode because I feel like playing it in the US only would be a little too easy, because there's always going to be clues of what state you're in and things like that. But it's a great game. I've had I've played the game a few times, and a couple of times this location has been in the U.S., but sometimes it just drops you in the middle of the Israeli desert along a dirt road, and you've got to figure out where in the hell you are.
That sounds awesome. I think my son would get a kick out of that.
Well, all right, Elliot. What do you say we stop this bullshit and start rolling some dice?
I'd love to.
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.